They took my work, my trust, and nearly my name. But what they didn't know is that betrayal doesn't break you. It teaches you how to rebuild without them. I used to think I could measure my life the way I measured a report, by the pages I'd turned, the edits I'd made, the clean signatures at the bottoms of agreements. I wore my suits the way I wore armor, each one chosen to fit the room I was walking into, a meeting with London clients, a strategy session with Paris, a workshop where I needed to be both firm and generous. My silver bracelet, my husband's anniversary gift, sat on my wrist like a quiet punctuation mark. In the corner of my office, a chipped mug that reads, "Not today," was my private joke with exhaustion. I am 48. It isn't a verdict. It's a map. 25 years in the industry taught me to read its terrain, where the quicksand of office politics lies, when to pivot, which alliances will hold when the conference room doors close. I climbed from junior analyst to vice president of operations strategy by being stubborn about two things: the work and the people I promised to protect. I learned to command respect without shouting, to steer younger teams by letting them feel the sail, not the rudder. Home, for me, was a different kind of architecture, quiet, crooked around the edges, lived in the way that makes it hard to leave. My husband and I had settled into the soft companionship of long marriage. No fireworks, but a lot of shared calendars and unremarkable dinners that felt more like anchors than constraints. Our children had scattered across time zones. Our video calls had a new rhythm, more listening, less instruction. I kept small rituals to stay steady: a walk along the river in rain, a new recipe on Sundays, a book that felt like a slow conversation. Those things protected me from abrupt storms. I didn't expect one to come from within the walls I trusted most. There was a colleague I thought of as more than a colleague. Her name was Emily, a detail that could be swapped without changing the shape of what happened. We met at a seminar years ago. She, bright and hungry. Me, newly testing the edges of leadership. We argued, we laughed, we shared late emails and breakfast croissants. I mentored her in the way older professionals do, steering, sharpening, sometimes stepping back so she could claim a win. When her project succeeded, I felt the modest warmth of a mentor's pride, not the cold clench of envy. She read my drafts, corrected my slides, and once, on a night where a client nearly unraveled a strategy, she sat with me and held the flashlight while I rewrote the end. Work looked ordinary from the outside. Meetings, deliverables, travel. But underneath was a project that had become my obsession over 2 long years, a swirling, delicate thing composed of every late night and every small compromise I'd made for the sake of progress. This project carried my name in ways that were invisible on org charts. The intuition of timing, the risky ideas I defended, the people I pulled together. I told friends about it. I told my husband in the shorthand of someone who leaves space in their life for difficulties and plans. I talked to Emily as if we were co-authors. I wasn't naive. I knew offices are arenas as much as workplaces, that alliances dissolve when stakes rise. I understood that trust is not a legal clause but a fragile fabric. And yet trusting someone you share late-night confessions and copy edits with makes betrayal feel less like a professional misstep and more like a personal fracture, like a teammate stepping off the lifeboat while you're still bailing water. That morning, standing before the mirror, adjusting my collar the way I always did, I could not yet hear the quiet crack that would run through everything. I could not know that some papers I'd sealed would resurface, reclassified and claimed by another. I could not imagine that the hand I'd clasped in solidarity might someday place my reputation on a ledger and try to settle it for their own gain. I had learned to avoid melodrama, to value dignity over spectacle. Still, I'd also learned that sometimes dignity requires a readiness to confront pain. That readiness, in me, was only just beginning to stir. The morning the small thing happened, I brewed coffee like I always do, black, 2 sugars, and stood at the window while the city unrolled below. My inbox had the usual clutter, meeting notes, invites, but then a subject line snagged me, final copy for. The attachment was the deck I'd lived with for 18 months, the one I'd defended in boardrooms. It looked like my skeleton in someone else's clothes. I opened it because curiosity is reflex. The file bore margin notes I didn't recognize, corporate edits that read like press copy, and the timeline had shifted forward by 2 weeks. A launch I'd scheduled for Q4 was suddenly Q3. Someone had moved the date and, with it, the project's air. My first thought was innocent. A junior had consolidated slides, marketing had drafted a speculative brief. Corporate life is messy, mistakes happen, but an email from marketing congratulating Emily and the team for an early rollout landed like a wrong note. Someone had written the epilogue before the story was finished. I checked metadata. The file was created 2 weeks earlier by an account outside our sub-team. Edit history showed changes at 2:17 a.m., someone else awake, reshaping the narrative I'd been crafting during the day. A precise chill ran through me, the first tremor under a familiar map. I walked to Emily's desk. She looked up with that locked-in smile we'd cultivated over years. "Did you see the press note?" "They're fast-tracking," she said, with practiced lightness and a casual click to another tab. "No surprise, no ownership." "It's a good problem to have," she added. Her dismissal should have calmed me. Instead, a knot tightened. I told myself I was being vigilant, protecting authorship, that common fear. In the elevator to HR, I rehearsed reasonable explanations. Back at my desk, the deck sat like an accusation. This project was not abstract. It had clients who'd staked budget lines on our timeline. It had partners who'd rearranged launches to dovetail with our phases. My name wasn't just pride, I'd used it as currency for trust inside the company. The idea that someone could reframe the narrative overnight, reassign ownership, or accelerate outcomes without my input felt like a violation of a contract we never signed out loud. So I began to keep records. Times, emails, names, phrases that felt off. I replayed our conversations, the late-night check-ins, the way she offered to polish my prose, the coffee where she laughed and said, "Just point me where to push." A thin pattern had emerged. For now it was only a spark, small, precise, not yet ablaze. I didn't extinguish it. I tucked it into my pocket like a coin and kept moving, awake in a way I hadn't been before, prepared, perhaps, to notice if the ember chose to burn. After the shock of finding that altered deck, I didn't march into the office with a banner or a plan. Instead, I became annoyingly, obsessively precise. I started following threads the way I once followed market indicators, quietly, daily, looking for patterns that might otherwise look like noise. It felt less like paranoia and more like doing the responsible work I was paid for. If someone was shifting timelines and narratives, I wanted to understand how and why before I called them a thief. The small things accumulated first. A lunch we'd scheduled that she canceled with a vague, "Oh, something came up," but she was visible all afternoon on our team channel, posting celebratory emojis under a client's announcement. A shared document she'd edited and marked final, with a comment that sounded like mine but used a phrase I never used in memos. An offhand remark in a meeting, "We've already agreed to X," when in fact we had argued for the opposite until very late the night before. Each incident by itself could be shrugged away. Together, they felt like a seam coming undone. I began saving versions of every file I touched. Old habits die hard. My first boss had instilled the habit of version control, like an act of professional hygiene. I exported emails to PDFs and archived Slack threads. I made a private spreadsheet, dates, times, authorship, a short note on the anomaly, and why it mattered. It felt almost childish to keep such a log, but it also felt like gathering a narrative in a language the company could not dismiss as memory or grievance. I was careful to record facts, not interpretations, timestamps, sender addresses, exact wording. Facts are harder to argue with than feelings. At home, I found myself recounting less and less. My husband noticed the quiet change, how I stared at my laptop after dinner, how I asked for the salt and then asked nothing else. When I tried to explain, I softened the edges. "There are some inconsistencies. I'm checking them." He nodded, the way someone does with a map they don't read often enough to navigate. It comforted me that my anxiety had not become a spectacle. It was private, deliberate, workmanlike. Emily's manner shifted in ways that were almost reflexive. She became busier, a little more careful with her compliments, as if she had learned to calibrate praise so it wouldn't be traced back to her. Sometimes she was suddenly formal in threads where she'd been informal before. Once she corrected me publicly on a point of data I knew I had double-checked. I felt the burn of being undermined, and then a colder feeling, the recognition that her calculus might have changed. If she wanted a seat in the sun, maybe she thought a little distance from me would look good. I watched for motive the way I watched for weather. Jealousy is too blunt a word for the complicated mix I suspected, ambition entwined with fear, a calculation about how quickly one must move before being overtaken. There were company rumors, the kind that moved through elevators and kitchenettes, restructuring, budget squeezes, a new boss evaluating performance. Pressure makes people choose. I tried to imagine myself in her shoes without excusing what she might have done. That exercise was useful. It made my anger less of a roar and more of a focused heat. Friends at similar stages of life called me intuitive and said I should go straight to HR. I nodded and listened, but resisted rushing. The stakes were not just professional, they were also personal. A confrontation without preparation could atomize everything: the project, our team, and even my credibility. So I continued with my ledger: the who, the when, the exact words. The threads grew longer and, unlike the frayed seam of my sweaters at home, they started to reveal a pattern. I was no longer only protective of the project. I was protective of myself, my reputation, the quiet investments of years, and the integrity I presented to a world that still, sometimes cruelly, counts women of my age as background players. I felt steadier for the record keeping. It gave me an axis to turn on when the ground under me felt slippery. That evening I saved the spreadsheet and closed the lid of my laptop like closing a book. The threads were visible now. What they would weave next, whether a net or a trap, I could not yet say. The first time I noticed the meetings, they looked like ordinary calendar squares, opaque and professional, until they began to multiply. Small blocks labeled strategy sync and stakeholder review that I had not been invited to, held in rooms whose glass faces suggested decisions were being made without me. At first, I told myself the obvious excuses. Someone else was closer to a vendor. Someone else had a particular relationship with a client. But when those meetings started to conclude with action items that mapped exactly to the pieces of work I had owned for months, the excuses thinned. Emily's calendar went from shared lunches and open brainstorming sessions to tightly scheduled, invite-only gatherings. She returned from one of them with a kind of new gravity, unreadable on her face. "They want rapid deliverables," she said, palms open as if to show there was nothing hidden. But her eyes were careful. "We might need to scale differently." I pressed for details. Her answers were measured, high-level stuff. Executive talk. The kind of phrasing you use when you've been given a narrative to keep. Then the subtle reassignments began. A liaison who had copied me for months was now exclusively copied to Emily. Project components that I had shepherded for weeks, testing schedules, partner agreements, client memos, started to land on her desk with a CC to me that felt more ceremonial than practical. At a town hall meeting, I watched her stand before a group of senior leaders and present a timeline that mirrored my plan. The slide deck had our results, our metrics, our suggested pivots. She spoke with a confidence I'd seen when we rehearsed together. She used phrases I had used in late-night edits. When she flashed the closing slide, she smiled at the room the way someone smiles after a performance they have not yet been applauded for. I asked my direct manager what was happening. He shuffled numbers and phrases like a man trying to be honest without picking a side. "We're consolidating leadership on this. The board wants a single point person for the rollout," he said. "Emily's got bandwidth." His eyes darted away when I mentioned the months of work I'd invested. He didn't mean to be cruel. He simply saw the problem as a logistics puzzle. To him, my months of late nights were line items. To me, they were pieces of myself. Outside the office, the tenor shifted too. A partner emailed Emily directly, thanking your team for fast-tracking a demo. A client called and congratulated her on being bold. When I corrected a misattribution in a reply, I felt the room grow colder. There were people who began to hedge their compliments, careful, like a crowd giving applause to someone who might later be asked to step down. Politics, I reminded myself again, it's the quiet arithmetic of survival in mid-sized corporations. What stung most was not merely the loss of ownership, but the choreography of removal, the way decisions were rerouted through her as if I were an instrument that had been replaced. The work I had done, the relationships I'd brokered, became an infrastructure that others could now operate without me. I felt like a gardener who had planted an orchard and was then told the harvest belonged to someone else. I could have stormed into the executive suite, stamped my authority with indignation, demanded acknowledgement. I did not. I had learned that performance out of anger rarely convinces people who matter. Instead, I began attending the offstage meetings. I asked to be in the room when stakeholders convened. Sometimes they said yes, sometimes they did not. When they did, I listened more than I spoke, sharpening the data in my head until it was incontrovertible. At night, I found myself rehearsing the words I would say if I were ever given a microphone again, not to beg, but to document and to remind. My ledger of files and timestamps grew columns that spelled out a history I intended to own. There was a small, strange relief in making the invisible visible. If they were going to move pieces, I would make sure there was a map showing who had placed them there. The quieter pain was personal. In the mirror at home, I tried to remove the lines of worry from my face with nothing but water and sleep. My husband, perceptive as he is, asked once, "Do you want me to say anything?" I shook my head. This felt like something I had to resolve on my own for reasons that were practical and strangely, intangibly moral. The betrayal by a colleague felt heavier because it was also a betrayal by proximity, someone who had seen me in vulnerability and still chose a route that sidelined me. Every offstage meeting, every redirected email, tightened the frame around the next move. I was no longer surprised when Emily's name appeared as the contact on external briefs or when her voice carried in rooms I had once led. The spark had become heat. The seams that had been fraying were beginning to split. Now that the removal was public, the work ahead of me was no longer about discovering whether betrayal had occurred. It was about how to respond with precision and principle. There was a particular gravity to those afternoons that made everything seem amplified. The hum of the office air conditioning, the clack of keyboards, the distant ring of a phone that always sounded like a bell tolling for someone else. I found myself pausing more often in doorways, listening to conversations I had once led. Listening, I realized, had become a way of measuring risk. Every extra word I heard that didn't include me felt like a subtraction from a life I'd spent building. I had never been one of those people who performs outrage. I learned early on that anger, when performed badly, becomes proof against you. Men who shouted were often mistaken for leaders. Women who shouted were labeled volatile. At 48, I had a particular sensitivity to those labels. I had watched younger women get boxed into categories, ambitious as a euphemism, difficult as an adjective, while the men around them kept titles. I had no desire to be another cautionary tale. And yet, the more the project shifted into other hands, the less I could stomach silence. At home, the small rituals that used to soothe me became intrusive. The way my husband folded the paper, the way he asked about dinner plans without looking up from his own screen. He meant well. He would say, "Speak up at the next meeting," the same way someone might recommend a brand of tea. Practical advice, but it didn't account for the texture of what was happening. This was not a bad slide deck or a missed deadline. This was an amendment to the narrative of my life at work, a reattribution that could ripple into promotions, into bonuses, into who people called when the next big problem surfaced. I felt a pull in two directions. On one side was the professional instinct, clear, rational, protocol-driven. Gather proof, consult HR, escalate through the right channels, present facts without emotion. On the other side was an older, rawer inclination to name the betrayal outright and demand an apology that might be only symbolic but would at least be audible. Naming it would feel like tearing a bandage off a wound. It would sting. It might liberate me. Or it might make me into an antagonist in other people's stories. The night I almost exploded, we were at a client dinner, one of those ritualized affairs where laughter is negotiated and reputations are hammered out across bread baskets. Emily sat 2 places to my left, her posture open, her laugh easy. A senior partner toasted the team and singled her out for her leadership on the accelerated rollout. The room murmured approval. My jaw tightened. For a moment I could see the scene in ancient relief, All the late edits, the nights I answered emails while my husband slept beside me, the mornings I rehearsed numbers until they felt like the lines of a script. They applauded the person who had made strategic choices without showing the work of patching the seams. I felt my face go hot. I practiced breathing slow measured because I did not want heat to be mistaken for hysteria. I considered standing. I considered saying, "Excuse me, that timeline was ours." Let me explain. It would have been a simple factual correction. But I knew how it would look: a woman interrupting a dinner, pointing fingers, creating spectacle. Someone else might call it assertive. More likely, some in the room would mark me as petty or insecure or unwilling to play the game. So I did not speak. I applauded, hollowly, and let the moment pass. Back at home I paced, then sat down and opened my ledger. The pull to be dramatic remained, but another pull, one that had always steadied me, reasserted itself. I have built my career on discipline, on the steady accrual of credibility. If I allowed myself to be pulled into a scene of public accusation without a foundation of incontrovertible facts, I would give them the narrative they could use against me, that I was reacting, not acting. The decision hardened into a method. I would act as if I were moving chess pieces, not stomping on a board. I began scheduling quiet meetings with a few trusted people: an old client who respected how I managed deadlines, a former mentee turned director who owed me nothing but whose courtesy was genuine. I made appointments with HR, but first I took the precaution of having a legal friend review my notes. I wanted my story to be undeniable: dates, drafts, exact emails. No adjectives. No, I feel S. Just the ledger of what had been done, by whom, and when. There was a cost to this. Every step that required circumspection felt like a concession to a system that rewards bluntness. I fretted about how others would perceive me, as calculating, perhaps, or stubbornly slow to defend myself. But I also knew that public melodrama would cost me relationships in a way carefully marshaled evidence would not. People who mattered, those who had seen my work before the shift, needed a reason to stand with me beyond sentiment. Facts could be that reason. Once I decided to act on procedure rather than pulse, the work turned into paperwork. It felt oddly domestic, a kind of house cleaning, only this house was a career. I started with what I already owned: my sent items, my local drafts, the archived versions that live on my machine when you remember to save. That first night, I exported everything into a folder labeled with the project name and the date. It felt absurdly ceremonial to name a folder like a case file, but ceremony can steady the hands. I was careful about boundaries. I did not, and would not, log into anyone else's accounts. I did not sneak around for server logs. I used only what was legitimately available to me: my mailbox, shared drives where my edits were recorded, and the version history on the documents we had used collaboratively. I took screenshots of Slack threads, downloaded PDFs of email threads, and exported version histories from the shared server. Where the platform allowed, I preserved metadata, timestamps, user IDs, the last modified line that sometimes tells you who is in a file at 2:17 a.m. It is surprising how persuasive a timestamp can be. I wrote everything down in a notebook I kept beside my bed, the old-fashioned kind with a leather cover. There is something about handwriting that makes a fact feel weightier. For each entry, I recorded the date, the time, the exact words used, and why the line mattered. When I quoted an email, I copied it verbatim: no adjectives, no color. Facts are less easily dismissed than a story built on hurt. I reached out, quietly, to two people who might corroborate my memory. One was a former client who liked working with me because I anticipated problems. The other was a junior team member who had been on calls while I negotiated the timeline. I did not say accusation or betrayal. I said, "Can you confirm whether we agreed to X on the call of Y date?" Their responses were short, factual, and exactly what I needed. Witnesses rarely liked drama either. They liked clarity. I also scheduled a preliminary conversation with HR. Their response was measured. They would listen but needed documentation. They suggested mediation as a first step, which I understood as their reflex for de-escalation. HR also warned me about retaliation and recommended I document any changes to my responsibilities or sudden shifts in reporting lines. They offered to pull server logs if we escalated, but only through formal procedure. That was a relief and a boundary both. The company could see what I could not see on my own, but those resources came with rules. At my lawyer friend's suggestion, I printed a copy of the file histories and had them notarized, a small, formal act that made the documents feel less like memory and more like evidence. It also felt dramatic in a way I hadn't intended, a legal friend folding over the corner of a PDF and stamping it like a seal. She reminded me, gently, that this was not about proving I was right in spirit, but proving that the attribution had shifted in practice. There were ethical needles to thread. I felt guilty sometimes in the quiet of the morning, a rush of shame. Was I exposing a friend? Was I turning a private wrong into a public thing because I couldn't bear being sidelined? Those questions did not dissipate the sting, but they tempered the language I used in notes and emails. I wanted the record to show restraint, not retribution. The ledger grew. So did the stakes. A potential promotion, bonuses tied to the project's success, the informal network of people who call you when a crisis lands. Each line I added felt like placing a book on a shelf, a public claim that this is mine. These are the pages I wrote. I slept less, but with purpose. By the time I closed my notebook that week, I understood two things clearly. First, evidence is stubborn. It insists on being read. Second, once you have a record, you can choose how loudly to read it aloud. I had the record. The next choice, how and when to present it, would be my next act. It happened on a Wednesday, the kind of day that carries no symbolism until it's over. I hadn't planned it. I went to the office with the same neutral expression I'd been perfecting for weeks, a careful mask of calm. But the moment I saw her walking out of the conference room, her arms full of folders, a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, something in me decided the time for waiting had expired. "Emily," I said, catching her in the hallway. My voice surprised me level, almost soft. "Can we talk a moment?" She blinked, scanning my face the way a person checks the sky before a storm. "Of course," she said, polite, cautious. We stepped into one of the small glass meeting rooms. The door clicked shut. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee and printer ink, the scent of routine, which made what followed seem even more surreal. I didn't bother with preamble. "I've been reviewing the project documentation," I began. "And I've noticed some discrepancies, files, presentations, timelines. I need to understand how those changes happened." Her posture stiffened, but her tone stayed smooth. "What kind of discrepancies?" she asked, too quickly. "The kind where my work appears under your name," I said. For a heartbeat, the room was silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. She looked down, rearranging the folders in her arms as if order could shield her. "You know how collaborative these things are," she said finally. "Everyone contributes. It's hard to separate who did what sometimes. That's why I keep records," I said. "It's not hard when you track contributions." And I have from the start. Her eyes flicked up to mine, sharp now, defensive. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking you to explain something," I said, still calm. "The edits at 2:17 a.m. last month. The presentation last week. The client brief you sent with my copy. I'm giving you a chance to tell me there's an innocent reason before I take it elsewhere." She exhaled, a slow release that sounded rehearsed. "You've always been particular," she said, choosing the word with care. "But this feels paranoid. We were a team. You mentored me. Don't turn this into a witch hunt." The word mentor landed like a knife. She was using my own generosity as cover. For a moment, I felt the heat of betrayal rise again, that rush of disbelief that a person you once shared secrets with could now talk to you like you were the problem. "I'm not hunting anyone," I said. "I'm clarifying authorship. That's all." She gave a small, incredulous laugh. "You think this will end well for you? You go to HR with some screenshots, some notes, and what? You'll look like someone who can't adapt. They'll see this as insecurity." That was the first time she dropped the polite mask, and it told me everything I needed to know. Fear hides behind arrogance. She wasn't calm, she was cornered. I didn't raise my voice. "Then I suppose we'll both see how it ends." I gathered my things, careful not to rush. My hands didn't shake, though my pulse was loud in my ears. As I reached for the door, she said quietly, "I didn't mean for it to go this far." I paused. It wasn't an apology. It was an admission. I turned back to her. "You did mean it," I said. "You just didn't expect to get caught." And I left. Outside, the corridor looked the same, people passing with coffee cups, small talk floating between desks, but I felt something shift. The confrontation hadn't fixed anything, but it had drawn a line, one that could no longer be blurred. That night, I wrote everything down in my ledger: the time, her words, her tone. It felt less like anger now, more like preparation. Because once a truth is spoken aloud, it stops being a suspicion. It becomes a record, and records, I had learned, have power. The day after the confrontation, the air in the office felt different, not colder, exactly, but charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm when everyone senses something shifting even if they can't name it. Conversations paused when I entered a room. Smiles felt delayed, calculated. News travels fast in open-plan offices. Tone, faster still. Emily avoided me. That, at least, was predictable. She spent most of the morning in meetings, doors closed, surrounded by the same group who had praised her 2 weeks before. I watched her from my desk, not with obsession, but with the focus of someone who's learned that vigilance is the last defense against revisionist history. Around midday, my manager, Richard, called me into his office. The man had a voice made for moderation, low, careful, incapable of offense. "I've heard there's some tension," he began, "between you and Emily." I didn't deny it. "There's a disagreement about authorship and process," I said evenly. "I've documented my contributions and shared the files with HR." His eyebrows lifted, just slightly. "HR already?" "I followed their procedure," I said. "They asked for evidence. I provided it." He leaned back, the diplomatic posture of someone recalculating in real time. "You know," he said slowly, "Emily has made some important connections with senior leadership lately. Her work on the rollout." "Was my work," I interrupted, before I could stop myself. Then softer, "At least, it began as mine. She accelerated the launch without authorization." He sighed, the way managers sigh when they sense a minefield. "Look," he said, "I'm not dismissing your concerns. But these things are tricky. If this becomes public, it reflects badly on the whole department. Why don't we try to resolve this quietly?" Quietly. The word struck me like static. Quiet was how this had started. Quiet was how she had erased me. With respect, I said, "Quiet resolution often means the person who is wronged ends up invisible. I've spent too long building this to vanish into someone else's version of events." He looked tired. "You're not invisible, Claire," he said. That was the first time he'd used my name all meeting, a signal that the conversation had moved from professional to personal. But sometimes protecting your reputation means knowing which fights to pick. I smiled, though it was an amusement. And sometimes protecting it means making sure your name stays where it belongs. The meeting ended with no clear outcome, just the understanding that the situation had become delicate. I left feeling both vindicated and isolated, a combination that can feel almost like vertigo. By late afternoon, I noticed subtle changes. My calendar invites for upcoming strategy meetings disappeared, not canceled, just modified. A few shared documents I'd had access to now returned, permission denied. In corporate life, retaliation rarely arrives with a signature. It comes disguised as technical glitches and calendar adjustments. That evening, an HR email arrived. Mediation meeting scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. Neutral location, neutral tone. It would be the first time Emily and I were in the same room under official supervision. The language was clinical, facilitated discussion, path toward mutual understanding. I doubted understanding was possible anymore, but formality has its own kind of gravity. At home, I poured a glass of wine and opened my notebook. My husband watched from the doorway, concerned. "You look like someone building a case," he said. "I am," I answered simply. He nodded, not in approval or disapproval, just in recognition. He'd seen me do this before, not in personal life, but in negotiations, audits, crisis projects. It was the same tone, the same focus. He knew it meant I was past anger and into something colder, steadier. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. The confrontation had cracked the surface. The fallout was only the beginning. But something about naming the truth aloud, even to a hostile room, had cleared the fog. Betrayal thrives in ambiguity. I was done being ambiguous. When morning came, I was ready, not for war exactly, but for precision. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that leaves a paper trail so clean no one can ever claim it didn't happen. Friday arrived with the kind of deceptive calm that precedes a storm. I dressed carefully that morning, navy blouse, tailored blazer, minimal jewelry. It wasn't vanity, it was armor. Clothes can say what your voice shouldn't have to repeat. I belong here. I am composed. I am credible. The mediation room was windowless, fluorescent, too cold. A small round table sat in the center with 3 chairs. One for me, one for Emily, one for the HR facilitator, a woman named Dana, polite but remote, with the practiced neutrality of someone who has seen far too many professional friendships curdle into legal liability. Emily arrived 2 minutes late. Her expression was carefully set, part contrition, part irritation. We didn't greet each other. Dana opened with a speech about fostering understanding and moving toward collaborative solutions. Her tone was so even it almost erased the tension vibrating in the air. I had promised myself I wouldn't start emotionally. So I opened my folder and placed a printed timeline on the table. These are the documented edits, version histories, and communications related to the project, I said evenly. Each item is dated and sourced. I'd like to establish a factual basis before we discuss interpretation. Dana nodded. That's fair. Emily, would you like to respond? Emily's lips pressed into a line. I'm not sure what there is to respond to, she said. Projects evolve. We collaborate. Sometimes credit overlaps. I almost smiled. The line was so polished, so perfectly corporate. Overlap isn't the same as substitution, I said. I slid forward 1 page, the 2:17 a.m. edit record. This file was changed from my account's shared draft to yours on July 12th. The metadata confirms it. The content was then submitted to marketing the following morning, labeled as your deliverable. She glanced down, quick and defensive. That must have been a mistake. Maybe the system. Systems don't alter names, I interrupted quietly. People do. Dana intervened, her voice a buffer. Let's keep this focused on facts. Emily, do you acknowledge that version was yours? A pause. Then, a small exhale. Yes, she said finally, but only because Claire said I could make edits while she was out. I didn't flinch. That's untrue, I said simply. And I have the email from that night where I specifically said, please hold off on edits until review. It's in your inbox too, if you'd like to check. Dana asked to see the message. I slid it forward. She scanned it, nodded, and set it aside with professional calm, but I caught the flicker in her eyes. Recognition. The silence that followed was long, thick, full of things neither of us wanted to say aloud. Finally, Emily spoke again, her voice smaller now. Look, I didn't mean for it to look like I was taking credit. Things moved fast. Leadership wanted results. There's a difference between moving fast and moving through someone else's work, I said. My tone surprised even me, not angry, just tired. I spent years teaching you how to navigate this place, how to lead without losing integrity. You learned well. Maybe too well. For the first time, her face softened. You think I did this on purpose? I looked at her steadily. I know you did. Dana cleared her throat, steering us back toward neutrality. It seems we have a breakdown of trust, she said. Given the evidence, I'll recommend that authorship on the project documentation be reviewed and corrected where appropriate. I'll also propose that both of you work on separate initiatives for the next quarter to minimize conflict. It was bureaucratic language for you win, but quietly. I thanked her, gathered my papers, and stood. Emily stayed seated, staring down at her hands. As I walked out, a strange calm settled over me. Not satisfaction, that would come later, if ever, but relief. The truth was now on record, in ink and timestamps and signatures. No one could rewrite it again without leaving a mark. Outside, the late morning sun hit me like a shock. The city noise rushed back into my ears, cars, voices, life continuing, indifferent to private wars. I stood there for a moment, breathing, realizing that this battle, though one in process, had changed me. There is a cost to defending your name. It isn't rage or exhaustion. It's the knowledge that innocence is something you trade the first time you learn how power really works. And I had just paid in full. After the mediation, the office went quiet around me, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that hums with avoidance. People who used to stop by my desk to chat now waved from a distance. Emails from senior leadership arrived colder, more formal. The polite fiction of neutrality had settled in. No one would say it aloud, but I had become the woman who went to HR. In corporate ecosystems, that title clings to you like static. Emily and I no longer shared meetings. Her name disappeared from my calendar entirely, just as Dana had suggested. But the strange thing about distance is that it doesn't create peace, it just changes the shape of the noise. I still saw her reflection in every company memo, every client presentation she now led alone. My words, sometimes whole phrases, lived on in her slides. The ownership had been corrected on internal records, but reputations move slower than facts. Still, something in me had shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. Or not in the same way. Anger, I'd realized, was a luxury, a distraction that lets you believe you're still playing defense. I was done defending. I began watching, listening, filing away the new landscape. People who had once sided with her now avoided taking sides at all, which told me they had noticed more than they'd admit. Then came the promotion list. It circulated every autumn, a neat internal memo outlining new department heads and lead roles. I hadn't expected to see my name. I knew my season for that recognition had passed. But I did expect fairness. When I read that Emily had been promoted to Director of Strategic Initiatives, I felt something colder than fury, disbelief, followed by clarity. She hadn't just survived the scandal, she had been rewarded for it. That night, I walked home through the city, the wind sharp with the scent of rain. I thought about all the years I'd given this place, all the late nights I'd traded for a title, for respect, for permanence. And then I thought of her younger, hungrier, unburdened by the quiet ethics I had once believed were shared. I wondered, not for the first time, whether integrity was just a luxury for those who hadn't yet been betrayed. My husband poured me a glass of wine when I got home. "You look like someone who's decided something," he said. "I have," I told him. "I'm not done." He didn't ask what that meant. Maybe he didn't need to. Over the next few weeks, I redirected my energy. I began reaching out to contacts, clients who trusted me, former colleagues who'd moved to competing firms. I didn't badmouth anyone. I simply asked how things were, if they ever needed consulting support, if they were still happy with our deliverables. It was polite, professional, and strategic. I was rebuilding my network, brick by brick, while quietly mapping the weak points in hers. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected email arrived. A senior client I'd handled years ago wrote, "We'd like you to consult on an upcoming strategy project. We'd prefer to work directly with you, not through the firm." That was the first crack. Within a month, 2 more clients followed suit. Nothing dramatic, just polite requests for my independent input. The kind that makes upper management nervous, because it hints at divided loyalties. Richard called me into his office again. "Are you planning to leave?" he asked, his voice tighter than before. "I'm exploring options," I said. "The company always encourages initiative, doesn't it?" He didn't smile. "Just be careful how far that initiative goes." But I already knew how far it would go. I wasn't going to sabotage anyone. I wasn't going to leak or lie. My revenge would be cleaner than that, not a knife, but an exit. A quiet one that would leave a vacuum exactly where they thought I was replaceable. That night, as I updated my resume, I realized something strange. I no longer wanted to reclaim what she'd taken. I wanted something bigger, freedom from the politics that had made this kind of betrayal possible in the first place. If she had used ambition as her weapon, I would use composure as mine. And in a world that mistakes silence for weakness, composure can be devastating. When I finally resigned, it wasn't dramatic. There was no speech, no confrontation, no symbolic slam of the door. Just a short email sent at 8:12 a.m. on a Monday, copied to HR and Richard, with the subject line, "Formal notice of resignation." The body contained 3 sentences: polite, unemotional, final. I gave 4 weeks' notice, which was standard, though Richard called me into his office less than an hour later. He looked both irritated and relieved, like a man who'd been holding his breath for months. "I wish you'd talked to me before making this decision," he said. "I did," I replied. "Several times." He nodded slowly, avoiding my eyes. "You've been an asset to this company, Claire. I hope you know that." I smiled, not bitterly, just wearily. I used to believe that meant something. We shook hands. It was a courteous ending to something that had once felt like a partnership. As I left his office, I felt oddly weightless, as if the ground itself had exhaled beneath me. Over the next weeks, the office took on a surreal quality, like a place I was visiting rather than inhabiting. People who had avoided me before suddenly reappeared, stopping by my desk to offer warm smiles and vague praise. "You're really brave, standing up for yourself." It's a shame how things turned out. Their sympathy came too late, and I met it with practiced kindness. Most weren't being malicious, just self-preserving. In offices like ours, loyalty always comes with an expiration date. Emily didn't speak to me. Not once. She avoided eye contact in corridors, skipped meetings where my presence was required, delegated any overlapping tasks to others. But I saw her watching me once, in the reflection of a glass partition. There was something in her gaze that wasn't triumph, but wariness. She understood now that I wasn't angry anymore, and that, I think, unsettled her. By my 3rd week, I had quietly accepted 2 consulting offers, one from a client who'd requested me by name, another from a firm abroad. I signed both privately. I didn't announce anything on LinkedIn, didn't broadcast it in farewell emails. Power, I'd learned, is often most effective when it's quiet. My last day came like a whisper. HR scheduled an exit interview. I answered their questions with precision and calm. When they asked what prompted my departure, I said simply, cultural misalignment. It was true in every sense that mattered. That afternoon, I cleaned out my desk, not much to pack, just a few notebooks, a photo of my husband and me in Lisbon, a plant I'd managed to keep alive for 3 years. Emily's laughter floated from a few desks away, brittle and forced. I didn't look up. As I handed in my badge at reception, the security guard, an older man who'd greeted me every morning for a decade, said quietly, "You'll be missed, Miss Hart." "Not for long," I replied with a smile. "But thank you." Outside, the city greeted me with sunlight and noise, both louder than I remembered. For the first time in years, I didn't have to be anywhere. I didn't have to perform calmness or defend authorship or measure my tone in every sentence. I could breathe. I walked without direction for nearly an hour, through streets I'd only ever driven past, feeling the slow return of something I hadn't realized I'd lost: curiosity. About myself, about what I could still build, about what life looked like without a hierarchy to navigate. That night, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine, my laptop open, contracts waiting for my signature. My husband came out, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "So, what now?" I looked at him and smiled. "Now," I said, "now I build something that can't be taken from me." And with that, I signed my name once, twice, and closed the laptop. The sound of the lid snapping shut felt like the end of one story and the clean, deliberate start of another. Leaving didn't end it. It never does. 3 months after I walked out of that building for the last time, my name started appearing again, not in the way I expected, and not from people I thought still remembered me. A journalist from an industry magazine reached out first. She was writing a piece on female leadership transitions in major firms. She wanted to ask about mentorship, collaboration, and ownership in creative teams. Her questions were polite but sharp, the kind that suggested she already knew parts of the story. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I simply said, document your sources carefully. Stories like that have a way of rewriting themselves. She thanked me, and I thought that would be the end of it. A few weeks later, the article appeared. The tone was measured, professional, but between the lines, anyone in the industry could read it. The piece described a senior strategist whose work had been rebranded under a younger colleague's name before a hasty internal correction. It didn't name names, but the details were unmistakable. And while it didn't call me a victim, it did something more powerful. It restored context. By the end of that week, 2 former colleagues reached out privately. "You were right," one wrote. "We saw it happening, but didn't know how to step in." The other, more bluntly, "Emily's been floundering without you. The new project missed its targets. People are noticing." I should have felt vindicated. I didn't. What I felt instead was a slow, steady quiet, not triumph, but peace. The world has a strange way of correcting its balance when you stop demanding that it do so. Still, the echoes kept coming. My consulting work grew faster than I'd anticipated. Clients I'd once managed through the firm now came directly to me, asking for the same clarity and discipline they'd trusted before. I built a small team, 2 women I'd mentored years ago, both sharp and deliberate. Together, we worked from my home office at first, then from a small co-working space overlooking the river. There was laughter again, the kind that doesn't have to be measured before it's released. But one morning, as I was preparing for a client call, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. Subject: "It wasn't supposed to happen like that." From Emily. I stared at it for a long time before opening it. "I don't know if this matters now, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. I thought I could handle the pressure, that the recognition would fix things. It didn't. I know I hurt you. I know you won't forgive me, but I needed to say it. No defense. No excuses. Just a few sentences that felt both late and oddly human." I didn't reply immediately. I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The sky was overcast, the river gray and rippled with wind. I realized, walking there, that forgiveness isn't something you give for their sake, it's something you allow for your own. That evening, I wrote back, "Thank you for saying that. I don't need an apology, but I hope you learn from it. We all have to decide what kind of mark we want to leave. I've made mine. I hope you find yours." Then I sent it and felt something uncoil inside me, a knot I hadn't even known I was still carrying. The next morning, she replied once more, "You already have." It was the simplest acknowledgement. And it was enough. For the first time since that morning months ago, I closed my inbox without dread. The echoes had finally softened into something bearable, not reminders of pain, but proof of distance. I had left that world, and it had finally begun to leave me. A year passed before I realized I had stopped checking my old company's website. There was no conscious decision to let go, just the gradual erosion of curiosity. The names on their leadership page no longer meant anything to me. Even the logo felt foreign. Time does that. It rewrites the geography of your life so completely that the old map stops making sense. My consulting firm, Heart Strategy, grew quietly, almost organically. We didn't advertise. We didn't need to. Word spread through referrals, the kind that carry more weight than any marketing campaign. We specialized in crisis strategy, ironically, helping teams rebuild after internal conflict, miscommunication, or betrayal. I sometimes smiled at the irony. The thing that had nearly broken me had become the foundation of what I now built for others. The work was different here. Cleaner. Human. There were no layers of politics to navigate, no hierarchies to bow to. I worked with clients who respected boundaries and results in equal measure. I hired deliberately, not for charm or pedigree, but for integrity. The three women who joined me were sharp, kind, unafraid of candor. We had weekly check-ins where honesty was not punished, where feedback was given without fear. The office air felt lighter than anything I'd breathed in years. Sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the light slanted across the river and the city hummed below, I caught myself thinking of that old world of Emily, of Richard, of the rooms where silence used to choke me. But the thoughts didn't sting anymore. They had lost their sharpness. They were just memories now, like pages in a book I'd already finished. One morning, I received a LinkedIn message from a young woman just starting her career. She wrote, "I read about your transition. I'm struggling with something similar, a colleague taking credit for my work. Everyone tells me to stay quiet. How did you decide to speak up?" I stared at her message for a long time, remembering the countless nights I'd spent wrestling with that same question. Finally, I typed, "You'll know it's time to speak when silence starts to feel like complicity. Gather your proof. Protect your dignity. And when you move forward, do it so gracefully that they'll never see the knife until it's already gone." I hesitated before sending it, then added one more line. "And when it's over, don't waste your life on revenge. Build something better instead." Her reply came within minutes. "Thank you." I needed to hear that. I closed the laptop and sat for a while, watching the water shift and glitter outside the window. Somewhere deep down, I felt that familiar ache, the recognition that pain, when properly used, can become a kind of architecture. My husband came in, coffee in hand. "You look far away," he said. "I was just thinking," I replied, "about how everything that almost ruined me ended up saving me." He smiled. "You always did have a talent for turning bruises into blueprints." I laughed softly because it was true. The bruise was long healed, but the lesson had stayed. Power is quieter than anyone tells you, and rebuilding is the most elegant revenge of all. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and the city blurred into gold, I opened my notebook, the same one that once held evidence and anger. I turned to the last blank page and wrote in careful script, "Not every ending is loss. Some are just the beginning choosing a better form." Then I closed it, placed it in the drawer, and locked it away, not out of secrecy, but completion. The story was finished. The woman who once fought for credit now owned her name, her company, and her peace. And for the first time in years, she no longer needed revenge to feel whole. It's strange, the silence that comes after a storm. Not empty, not absence, but a fullness of quiet that feels earned. It took me a long time to recognize that peace doesn't always announce itself with relief. Sometimes it arrives like the softest shift of air, unnoticed until you realize you're breathing differently. 2 years have passed since I left that company. I don't think of it much anymore, not with anger, not even with nostalgia. Just as a former address, a place I once lived, learned, and outgrew. Every so often, I'll pass their glass building on the way to a client meeting. It still looks the same, the polished facade, the revolving doors, the sharp silhouettes of people hurrying through corridors. But I no longer feel the pull to belong there. I've built my own world now, and it fits. My days have a rhythm that's almost meditative. Mornings start early, coffee in hand, sunlight spilling across the desk where my team gathers for our calls. We talk about deadlines and clients, but also about boundaries, how to protect our time, our integrity, our joy. These are the conversations I wish someone had taught me to have earlier in my career. Maybe that's what redemption looks like, not payback, but prevention. Every Friday, I meet with my team in person. We work, we laugh, we take walks by the river. There's a mural near the co-working space, a woman standing tall, her silhouette cut through with light. Beneath it, someone has scrawled in white paint, "She built what they tried to take." The first time I saw it, I stopped. Now I see it every week, and it feels like both prophecy and closure. Sometimes I think about Emily, not with bitterness, but curiosity. I heard she left the company too. moved to another city, started again, as people often do. I hope she learned what I did. That ambition without conscience is just hunger in disguise. I hope she found a softer kind of success, one that doesn't require someone else's shadow. I've stopped needing to win. That's the quiet miracle of surviving betrayal. You learn that victory is not reclaiming what was stolen, but outgrowing the need to prove it mattered. The world eventually forgets who took credit and who didn't, but it remembers who endured with grace. On the anniversary of my company's founding, my husband took me to dinner. He raised his glass and said, "You've come a long way from the woman who used to write her pain in ledgers." I smiled. Now I write blueprints. Later that night, after the city lights softened into the river, I opened my old notebook, the one filled with dates, evidence, hurt, and flipped through the pages. I didn't feel the sting I once did. Each entry was just a record of a different version of me, the one who had to learn the hard way that survival isn't stoicism, it's strategy. At the very end, beneath the last line I'd written months earlier, I added one final sentence. She didn't get even. She got free. And then I closed the book for good. Outside, the wind moved gently through the same city where I had once fought for space, for credit, for my own name. Now, the sound didn't feel like noise at all. It felt like applause. Quiet, patient, and finally deserved.